We'll be looking at Colossians chapter 1 tonight. Colossians chapter 1, if you have your Bibles, it might be helpful to turn there. It was good to be with you this afternoon in the fellowship meal. That was quite a delightful treat. I think all my years of going to church, it's the first church I've ever been at where they have doggy bags from a church potluck. And you can take things to go. And I hope that idea spreads. I think we should write it up for the Christian Chronicle or the Gospel Advocate. You're onto something here. That was remarkable. When I was a full-time preacher, we had 3 Sunday morning services. It was a large church in Memphis, and sometimes even had 4. But it had been a long time since I preached 3 times in one Sunday, and I was sitting there thinking about Moses. In Deuteronomy preached 3 times, and then he died. And then the lights went out. And I thought, was that predictive prophecy or something? I wasn't sure. There was a play done in New York City. It was off Broadway. In fact, it was held at the 7th Regiment Armory in New York City. It was called Tamara, T-A-M-A-R-A. It was an unusual play. About 160 people came to see the play. But the Armory building is not a theater. It's not an auditorium. It's just an office building, 3 or 4 floors. And so there's no auditorium. There's no seating. There's no stage. There's no curtain. There are no lights. But the play just took place in different rooms on different floors. And so the actresses and actors would just move around from room to room and recite their lines. And the people who were the guests, the audience, could just be in whatever room they wanted to. So they could, if they wanted, stay in one room, and as the players came through, they would hear that part of the play. Or they could follow an actress or an actor around and just hear what they had to say. And people had unusual reactions to the play. First of all, they realized that no 2 people, unless they stuck together, saw the same play, because everybody was in a different room at a different time with a different group of actors and actresses. Everybody saw a different version of Tamara. And then they got concerned because they wondered, well, if I stay here in the basement, what if the really important acts are taking place on the 2nd floor? What if I miss something? Or if I follow the butler around and the play is really about the socialite, what's going to happen? Well, the reviewers had a heyday with the play, but it was hard to miss the main point of Tamara, and that is, truth is in the eye of the beholder. And the play was saying there is no one truth. There is no truth for everybody, but rather each person sees truth in their own way. Each person sees life the way they want to see it, and I determine the outcome of my life. Well, Tamara represents what's going on in our culture. A couple of things. One is we're in the midst of this tremendous explosion of information, and not just information, but ready access to the information. So I have a cell phone here, and I can open up Google, and you can give me a topic, and I can bring up so much information on that topic that you could not read it all in the rest of your life. And it's right here at our fingertips. So we're in the midst of this explosion of availability of information. So things that used to be unavailable or that you'd have to go halfway across the world to see or to find or to look at, you can now have on your digital piece of equipment. The other piece of what's going on is that people in our society have given up on one truth, sometimes called pluralism, that there are many truths out there, or relativism, that no one truth is good for everybody. And so where does that leave us in life? And where do we turn? And who do we trust? Well, I'd like to suggest to you that the church in Colossae was going through a very similar kind of situation that we're going through today. And that as the Apostle Paul writes this 4-chapter book, he is in effect addressing the issue of Tamara. He's addressing the issue of information explosion. He's addressing the issue of relativism and pluralism. So as we begin to study this book, I'd like to call your attention to chapter 2, verse 1. I know that's an odd place to start, but Paul becomes very personal here. And he says this, he says, "For I want you to know how greatly I strive for you and for those at Laodicea and for all who have not seen my face." Well, it's an interesting line. Colossae and Laodicea were two cities in the Lycus River Valley, south of what we call Istanbul, east of Ephesus. It's in Turkey today, just archaeological sites there. But at one time, these two cities were there, and Paul apparently is writing to both of those congregations in both cities. And it's interesting that he's never been there. It's not a church he started. It was not a place where he ministered. It was not a congregation that he had preached for the one at Laodicea either. And yet, he says, I greatly strive for you. It's interesting. And we might get all enthused and encouraged or worked up or concerned about a congregation where we grew up or this congregation where we're now members, but we don't necessarily get worked up about what's going on at a church in New York or church out in Arizona. But Paul was concerned about this church. And look at the last verse of chapter 1. "For this I toil, striving with all the energy which he mightily inspires within me." Paul is really engaged with whatever is going on in this congregation. Well, what's happening here? Well, there are problems at Colossae. And the problem is that the people are beginning to listen to other voices. Now, we don't know a lot about this, but just look at a couple of verses with me. In chapter 16, which will part of our text, he talks about thrones, dominions, principalities, authorities. We're not quite sure what some of those things are. Thrones would be some sort of government role, but dominion, principalities, authorities, we're not quite sure what he's talking about. But these were sources of authority, voices that the church in Colossae had started to pay attention to. Or look over in chapter 2, verse 8. He talks about, see to it that no one makes prey of you by philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe. If you don't know what those terms mean, well, join the crowd. No one knows. You can read the commentators, and they're basically guessing about what some of these terms mean. We don't think philosophy is the major that they have in Marietta College, but it's a name for these voices that the Colossian church was listening to. Empty deceit, human tradition, that one makes a little more sense. Elemental spirits of the universe, what's that? Or look at verse 16, still in chapter 2. "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, with regard to a festival, a new moon, or a Sabbath." Sounds a little bit like the Old Testament, a little bit like Judaism. Or verse 18, "Let no one disqualify you, insisting on self-abasement, worship of angels, taking a stand on visions, puffed up without reason by a sensuous mind." If you get somewhat cloudy when you read that, join everyone who's read the book before you. We're not quite sure what was going on in Colossae that these terms refer to. There were other voices that they were listening to in the Colossian church. Well, Paul's response to this is that 4 times he says, don't listen to them. And so look in verse 4 of chapter 2. He says, "I say this in order that no one may delude you with beguiling speech." No one. So there was someone out there deluding them with this lying, deceitful speech. He says, don't let no one do that. And then he says again in verse 8, which we've already, "See to it that no one," you'll say this "no one" 4 times, "no one makes a prey of you." So it's the idea of a hunter going after an animal, and these other authorities are the hunter, and the Colossian church, they're the animal. Don't let anybody make prey of you. In 16 we looked at, but there it is again. "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you," with all these questions. Verse 18, there it is again, let no one, you see it 4 times, let no one. That's his advice to these people. Don't listen to these things. Well, we're not sure what's going on. Some people think that in Colossae we have an early form of Gnosticism. Don't want to go too far here. Gnosticism is a Christian heresy, develops in the 2nd century. Don't really have any evidence of it in the 1st century unless it's here in Colossae. It's the idea that at the beginning of time, wisdom, which is personified in the Old Testament like Proverbs 8 as a woman, was with God, and God told wisdom the secrets of life. And then wisdom passes on those secrets to just 1 or 2 people in every generation, and wisdom passed on those secrets to Jesus. And what you want to do is you want to get to know one of the people to whom the secret has been passed on to. And so the cross, death, burial, and resurrection, baptism, none of that has anything to do with Gnosticism because it's all about knowing those special people. Well, maybe I said too much there, but some people think maybe it's an early form of Gnosticism. Others say, no, what's going on in Colossae is a Jewish syncretism. Again, a hard word. Syncretism simply means when you have one religious belief that starts blending in with other religious beliefs, and you get sort of a mixture of things. And so you have 1st century Judaism, rabbinic Judaism that Paul and others react to in the New Testament, and it's getting mixed up with perhaps some Roman religion or Greek religions. And so it's not what we read in the Old Testament, but it's some sort of altered version of it. And then others think that it was some sort of folk religion that was just going on in this valley. And we have coins that we've dug up at Laodicea and Colossae that have pictures of gods on that we just really don't recognize from any other source. And so perhaps there was some kind of folk religion going on that they were listening to. Bottom line is, read the commentators, read the scholars. No one really knows. But Paul says, don't let anyone despise you. Now, so what's going on so far? Paul's never been to Colossae. He's all worked up about it. He writes this letter. He's concerned that they are listening to these other voices out there. And it's a rough parallel to our situation because we live in a world where there are many other voices. You can get on the internet. You can get on the media. You can go down to the library. It was mentioned in our prayer about what's other voices being taught to our children in the schools. And so our time is filled with this multiplicity of authorities and voices. Well, what Paul does is he says, you need to look at Jesus. And so we have in this book probably the fullest treatment of who Jesus is and what he meant anywhere in the New Testament. So this is really the Jesus book. Now we have the Gospels that tell the story of Jesus' life. Yes, for sure. But this book explores the theological, the doctrinal playing out of the life of Jesus. And it all comes to a head in our text here in chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. And some people think this was an ancient hymn. And just as we've had some singing tonight, they chanted this song. There's another one, Philippians 2, perhaps 1 Corinthians 13. Some people think these are hymns. Now, there's no poetry here. It doesn't rhyme. There's no meter. But there are some repeated ideas. But it's lofty material, to say the least. Now, as you read through Colossians, you find this third-person masculine pronoun used repeatedly. That's he, his, him, himself. It's used all through the book of Colossians. Well, who is the he? The he is Jesus. So every time that third-person masculine singular pronoun is used in Colossians, it refers to Jesus. And that's helpful to know as you read the book. And all through this hymn, this text, we have this third-person pronoun. And with your permission, I'm going to reread the text. But every time I come to that pronoun, I'm going to put Jesus in. And just listen to what it says. So here's the reading of this text with the pronouns replaced by the antecedent. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in Jesus all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or authorities. All things were created through Jesus and for Jesus. Jesus is before all things, and in Jesus all things hold together. Jesus is the head of the body, the church. Jesus is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything Jesus might be preeminent. For in Jesus all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through Jesus to reconcile to Jesus all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of Jesus' cross. Well, when you start thinking about this text, you realize it's a very rich text, and we could spend a whole quarter of classes or sermons unpacking this. He's divine, he's creator, he's above the principalities, authorities, all these things that they're listening to. He's the head of the church. He's the first of many to be resurrected. God dwells in him. He reconciles all things, and we have peace through him. It's about Jesus. And Paul's point is, don't listen to the voices. Listen to Jesus. Now, another quality of the book of Colossians is it's filled with superlatives. So the word superlative means the highest or the best. And so if you go through the 4 chapters, you find about 60 different superlatives. Everything, every man, always, all the time, fullness, 60 times. And the word all, A-L-L, is 26 times in the book. Well, what's Paul saying? He's trying to say that Jesus is all we need. Well, let's just look back at the poem, back at this text. And it's interesting, in this little poem, in this little hymn, the word all, A-L-L, is used 7 times. Let's just look at those and unpack them just briefly. First one's in verse 15. He's the firstborn of all creation. Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. What's firstborn mean? Well, it's an idiom, figure of speech, which really means the word authority. He's the highest authority in creation. And so what Paul was saying here is you can line up all the authorities you know. Trump and Obama and Kasich, and you can line up the presidents of the past century and Eisenhower and Churchill and Hitler and Stalin. And you can go back through history and just start lining up Lee and Lincoln and Grant and Washington and Napoleon, and just go on through history, line them all up, all the authorities who have ever existed. And at the front of that line is Jesus Christ. He comes before all those authorities. And so he says, Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. Then verse 15 again, the second all, in Jesus all things were created. And so as we look around what exists, everything that exists was made by Jesus. It was either it's made from something Jesus made, or it's something that Jesus made. So the wood in this church building came from trees, and the trees were made by Jesus. And the clothes we wear came from a variety of sources, and those sources were made by Jesus. My father he's passed now, but whenever he would buy something, he always wanted to find out where it was made, because he was a Buy USA man. It had to say made in USA, or he wouldn't buy it. He just wouldn't buy it. And so he will look for that label, made in USA. Well, if you look at the world and you look at the label in the world, it says made by Jesus. Made by Jesus. So verse 15, in Jesus all things were created. And then verse 17 is the third all. Jesus is before all things. And so there's nothing in creation that comes before Jesus. So you can go to the library, and you can't find a book there that Jesus doesn't exist before the book. You can go to any website you want to, and you can't find a website that has information on it that Jesus doesn't predate. You can look at all the philosophies of the world, and you can't find a single philosophy that comes before Jesus. And so go back to the beginning. Go back to the very beginning when everything started. before everything's created, that moment before the world comes into existence, and there is Jesus. And so he is before, Jesus is before all things, verse 17. And then in verse 17 again, it says, in Jesus all things hold together. He's the cosmic glue. Now, I assume you've had the same situation that I've had, where you break something and you go to the hardware store to buy the glue, and you go, well, this one glues paper together, and this one glues wood together, and this glues plastics together if they're this kind of plastic, and this one glues another kind of plastic, and you buy the glue and you try it and it still doesn't work. Well, Jesus is the glue that always works. He causes everything to cohere. We have the song, blessed be the tie that binds. Jesus is the tie that binds. Then the next one is in verse 19. In Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. In Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. So if God had a house, if God had an address, his address would be Jesus Christ. That's where God lives. All the fullness of God lives in Jesus. That's repeated in chapter 2, verse 9. And so if God has a house, Jesus is that house. And then the seventh all in this little section, verse 20, he reconciles to himself, he reconciles to Jesus all things. So we live in a broken world. Talked a little bit about that earlier. We have orphans, we have widows, we have people who are improperly imprisoned, we have people who are oppressed. One out of every 35 people in the world today is a refugee. The world's a broken place. But it wasn't made that way. It was made a good world. But Jesus comes along and he fixes the world. He puts it back together. He restores the world. Well, that's a remarkable statement. And so what's Paul saying? And how does this relate to what I raised earlier? Well, let me make 4 points and we'll quit. Number one, Paul is saying Jesus is the answer to all your questions. Now, not the simple questions. Not, where's the nearest McDonald's? Or how do I get to Roger Rush's office? Or, what time is this preacher going to quit? But the really significant questions of life. How do I deal with my failures? How do I deal with my futility? What do I do about the finality of life? All those really core questions that we wrestle with, Jesus is the answer. Why do innocent people die? Why is life so hard? Why are so many people evil? The answers to those questions are all tied up in Jesus. And so Paul's telling these people in Colossae, you don't have to listen to the authorities and the elemental spirits and the philosophies. And he's telling you in Marietta, Ohio, you don't have to go to the websites. You don't have to listen to the public school teachers, because Jesus is the answer to all questions. And then secondly, there's nobody in the past and there's nobody in the future that will know more than Jesus knows. And so we do well by reading philosophy and history. That's all fine. But no one has more truth than Jesus. And if we could somehow look ahead to what's going to happen in the next 100 years, be a huge amount of change given what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years. If we could know all that now, if we could just have all that information about the way things are going to be different, we still have assurance that Jesus knows more than all that put together. So nobody in the past, nobody in the future will know more about life than Jesus. And then number 3, I think the poem is telling us that Jesus knows about the next life. So I mentioned this earlier that we've all known people who have died, and we've been to their funerals. We've had loved ones who have passed. We go to the graveyard, but we don't know anyone. None of us know anyone who has died and been buried and then raised from the dead. We've never met anybody, but Jesus has done that, and he's been to the other side. He's come back and he says, you don't have to be afraid, because I can take you where I've been. So Jesus knows about the next life. And then number 4, last one, Jesus removes the fear about this life. We don't have to worry about getting it wrong. We don't have to worry about going to the wrong dad or the wrong website, seeing the play in the wrong room. If you're listening to Jesus, you're getting the best, the most accurate, you're getting the truth about life. So Tamara, the play, took place in New York City. Takes place in a building with many rooms. It kind of leaves us a little fearful and a little confused. Play taking place in a spot that has many rooms. Well, let me leave you with this text. This is John 14, about many rooms. It's Jesus, the one who tells the truth speaking. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And when I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am going, you may be also. And you know the way that I am going. Thomas said, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said to Thomas, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by me. Well, when we come to the invitation, I think we can rest assured that what we know from Jesus about how to deal with this life's sins and failures, how to gain access to the next life, how to find purpose in this life, is all found in the directions he's given us. So we have to believe what he said. We have to believe his worldview. We have to believe that he is the one who knows the truth, who tells the truth, and who leads us to the truth. And where our lives don't match that truth, we have to change our lives, bring them into subjection to the way he wants us to live. And we have to admit to other people, this is the one who's the way, the truth, and the life. He's Lord, he's Savior. And then we join him in his death, burial, and resurrection and baptism as we die and we're buried and resurrected to a new life. Well, maybe you want to do that tonight or this afternoon.